Howard Barker has been acclaimed as England's greatest living dramatist by the Times. The late Sarah Kane has called him the Shakespeare of our age. He was born in 1946 in South London to a working-class family. His father was a bookbinder and a trade unionist, and his left-wing sympathies very much influenced Barker's early plays. His mother sent him for lessons in elocution, and observing his timidity, observed that she wanted him to be one of the boys. But he preferred the company of women, both young and old, all his life. He has said that neither of his parents spared him love. He used to listen to radio plays with his parents in a darkened room, so it's rather nice that the very first play he had produced by the BBC was in 1970, and it was a radio play. The title of that play was One Afternoon on the 63rd Level of the North Face of the Pyramid of Cheops the Great. Now, since 1969, Howard Barker has written over 100 dramatic works, largely for the theater, but also for radio and television. He's produced 6 volumes of poetry and 2 volumes of aesthetic and philosophic theory. He's also written an autobiography. He has designed sets and costumes under aliases like Tomek Leipzig, Billy Kaiser, and Caroline Shintang. He's also painted extensively, and his works have been exhibited internationally. We have 11 on show here at the print room. His best-known plays are Victory, The Castle, Scenes from an Execution, which is now on at the National, and Gertrude the Cry, which is a subversive text questioning Shakespeare's Hamlet. Now, about Gertrude and other of these subversive texts, it's said that the characters and the events depart from the familiar narratives, and they do that to question the moral values which are normally associated with those narratives. Now, an example of some of these other plays are Utopia, which questions Thomas More's Utopia, The Seven Lears, which asks, why does King Lear not have a wife? And Vanya, which questions the sympathies we normally associate with Uncle Vanya. Barker has said, there's an obligation to deal with existing myths. I am not an iconoclast. What I am trying to do is expose something that convention has made too solid. The conventional treatment of Gertrude dismisses her as an oversexed bad mother. My question was, why is that woman rendered so horrific when she's driven by love? Barker wrote Lot and His God in 2006, and it was first premiered in Paris in 2009, in January, at the Théâtre de l'Étang. But his very first play was produced at the Royal Court in 1970. And he has said since then that he's had a pretty dire time in English theater. Because his initial plays were political, they were very much acts of social realism, and he had recoiled from that shortly after writing those kind of plays. He said, I was quite nauseated by social realism. He said that his first instincts were always to invent, not to describe, to imagine what might be impossible, to estrange and resist conventional empathy. David Raby has said that since the 1980s, his plays avoid both contemporary settings and historical facts, though they're often inspired by figures from history. And they do this in order to release an imaginative speculation on what might happen, rather than on what did or what must. Barker said, I knew I wanted to write about people who did the wrong thing persistently. An example of that is his play, The Europeans, which was produced in 1987. And in that play, a woman never is reconciled to her rapist, and she never forgives them. Apparently, Trevor Nunn threw that play across the room. Barker said, the prejudice against my work in England is predicated on something that probably goes back to the Reformation, which is the idea of the utility of the works of art. These plays have no use. His plays have been performed widely in Europe, more widely, in fact, than in England. He has also said the French don't ask art to have a use. In France, during the season of 2009 and 2010, his drama was the subject of a major retrospective season. 7 of his plays were produced and 4 at the French National Theatre. He has his own company, the Wrestling School, which is devoted to producing his plays solely, and it was formed in 1988. It was formed not by Barker himself, but by the actor Kenny Ireland, and its strongest supporters have been actors both in the RSC and at the Royal Court. Barker has said that he needed the Wrestling School. He failed to make friends in the theatre. He had enemies both on the right and the left, united in their moral earnestness, he has said. His company is now regarded as one of the leading exponents of text-based theatre, both in the UK and on the continent. He began with his company for the first time to direct his own plays, which is very satisfying. Also, he could create with his actors an aesthetic and an experience which he termed the theatre of catastrophe. Barker, of course, gave the company its name, and with regard to that name, Raby has said that Barker's characters wrestle with profound experiences which estrange others, their surroundings, and themselves to themselves. Barker thinks that his writing is constantly about confrontation. People are always up against each other. They're at the extremes of their emotional life. Raby says that the focus on individuals struggling at their limits opens up possibilities, indicating that there's something beyond those limits. Raby says that Barker resists the notion that human nature is predictable or mechanistic, easily explained by theories of rationality and/or gratification. Barker thinks that the art of theatre is darkness because it speaks to darkness. He asks, how does it protect the wealth of its darkness from the enlighteners? The following poem is from Barker's preface to the BBC production of The Possibilities. We failed to think correctly. There is hope. We persist in our blindness. There is hope. We are intransigent at the wrong moment. We capitulate at the wrong moment. There is the sole chance of deliverance. Charmian Saville has said that Barker's characters permit the theatre audience neither envy nor power. This is because audience members are unlikely to wish consistently to be them and unlikely to want consistently to despise or pity them. Regarding Barker's language, it's taken him some time, he said, to grasp the range of the spoken word, the arc of its effect. And this is in a culture frantic with images, fevered with pictures and products, visually sick. Barker says, my characters speak fully in a way that is impossible in naturalism. They have excess articulation. I aim deliberately at plethora, knowing full well the public can't keep up. The speeches are broken, themes dropped and recovered again, strange, swift perceptions suddenly described, then buried under coarse banality. Juliet Stevenson has talked of the unrivaled beauty of speaking the words that Barker has written. He has a poet's and a musician's understanding of the rhythms of language and how these are linked to our internal lives. Barker likes to quote Nietzsche, who said that if you don't know the rhythm of a sentence, you don't know the meaning of it. Barker says, I think that sound and rhythm can communicate as much to the public as if they were listening to an argument. Now, he often does odd things with the punctuation in the text of his plays, and especially in Lawton is God, which has no full stops, no commas, no pauses marked in the text. And he says that he does this so that the actors are not taught by conventional punctuation what the rhythm of the text is. A few comments about ecstasy in Barker's plays, sexual or otherwise. He said in a documentary in 1999, sexuality is the only thing that draws us completely out of ourselves and exposes the extreme. The desire to conquer, own, possess, and simultaneously to surrender and be possessed. This delicate oscillation is quite the most extraordinary facet of our existence, he thinks. He said, in an era when sexuality is simultaneously cheap, domestic, and soon to be forbidden, desire becomes the field of inquiry most likely to stimulate a creative disorder. He says, sexual seduction is exquisitely irresponsible and socially disruptive. But it's necessary to admit the symbolic nature of sexuality. One writes not only of the body, what does the body represent as longed for, possessed, entered, maimed. Barker observes how in the theater, something is always lost. In a world of relentless aggregation, to lose is a lightness. It can be an intoxication, he says. What is it then that is lost? The burden of your moral convictions. Raby has said that Barker's theater of catastrophe offers this strange gift of loss. The loss of everything consoling. This is not only or merely a devastation. The breakup equilibrium offers release. Now, Barker thinks that the bravery of tragedy lies in its refutation of the pleasure as an organizing principle of existence. Who would deny that this contempt for pleasure is also an ecstasy? Barker asks, tragedy says, how should we live? But tragedy answers the question, how shall we live? In the very act of exposing the way into death. It draws death back into life and then consequently alters life. A few remarks about what Barker wants from his audience and what he wants to give to his audience. He says that the theater must start to take its audience seriously. It must stop telling them stories they can understand. In Barker's work, no attempt is made to satisfy a demand for clarity, and he has no simple meaning or message. His plays, he says, work on instincts. They're not working through the irrational, the critical, or the objective. Barker says, there are people who wish to be stretched, challenged, and even depressed by a work of art. And these people will make considerable efforts to experience those things. The theater should be a taxing experience, he thinks. The greatest achievement of a writer is to produce a character who creates anxiety. We elevate anxiety over all things but beauty. And for him, beauty in the theater is characterized by brevity, its instability, and its ill health. Barker also admits, I'm never at peace. I want to say a little bit about the play Lawton is God and the biblical myth behind that play. Raby has said that Barker disrupts received histories and myths by testimony and performance of individual pain, articulated by those marginalized. The living dead turn the tables and discover language. Some force conventionally repressed as abject erupts into the center of the stage to claim dramatic primacy and wreak havoc. Now, concerning the story of Lot in the Bible, Lot was born about 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, and he and his uncle left Mesopotamia to go to the new land of Canaan and find a new home. His uncle was Abraham, of course, the great patriarch who is supposed to be the founder of the Jewish race. Lot and Abraham both became very wealthy. They had a lot of livestock, and their herders were competing for the same watering hole, the same land. So Abraham advised Lot to go separate, and Lot decided to take the land just beyond the river Jordan, where the cities Sodom and Gomorrah lay. And Abraham went south. The book of Genesis, chapter 13, reads, Lot pitched his tent toward Sodom, but the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. Now, more than 20 years later, Abraham was visited by 3 men. Those men in the Bible are said to be the Lord and 2 angels. And the Lord informs Abraham that his wife is going to have a child. This is going to be a miraculous event because both Abraham and his wife are sexually dead at this point. And the angels then leave, and the Lord informs Abraham that he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, Abraham is horrified at this fact because, of course, Lot, his beloved nephew, lives there, and he pleads with the Lord to spare Sodom and Gomorrah. He says, well, if there are 40 righteous men, will you let the city survive? And the Lord says, yes. And then Abraham bargains with it because he suspects, of course, that there aren't 40 righteous men. And he goes down to 10. If there are 10 righteous men, will you spare Sodom and Gomorrah? And the Lord says, yes. Well, apparently in the Lord's eyes, there weren't 10 righteous men because these 2 angels came to Sodom knowing that the city would be destroyed. Lot was at the city's gate, and when he saw these 2 men, beautiful men, he welcomed them into the city and said, you may stay in my home this evening. And the men were grateful for his his welcome, and no sooner had they got there than a crowd of men from the town of Sodom surrounded Lot's house and wanted the men to come outside. Now the Bible implies that these men wanted Lot's two visitors for sexual reasons. And Lot said to this crowd of men, no, you cannot have my two visitors, but you can have my daughters instead. The men refused Lot's offer of his daughters, and because they were getting rather angry, Lot was brought inside, the two angels were inside, and they then blinded all of the men outside the door. That night, the angels warned Lot that the city would be destroyed. So Lot went out to visit his two sons-in-law to warn them that the city would be destroyed and beg that they would come with him to escape from the city. His two sons-in-law mocked Lot. So the next morning, Lot, his two daughters, and his wife left Sodom. The angels warned Lot and the family not to look back, not to pause anywhere on the plain as they were fleeing. Genesis 19:24 reads, "Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven." Lot and his family reached Zoar as they were crossing the plain. And though they weren't supposed to stop, Lot begged the angels to let them stop. And the angel changed his mind and said, "Okay, we're going to spare Zoar, you can stay here." And right at that point, Lot's wife disobeyed the angel's command. Verse 26 reads, "His wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt." Meanwhile, Lot and his daughters decided not to stay in Zoar, and they went to a cave. And of course, these daughters had lost their husbands, and they were worried about Lot having any descendants. So they decided to make him drunk one night, and one daughter slept with him, and on the following night, the other daughter slept with him. And from these two acts of sexual intercourse came the race of the Ammonites and the race of the Moabites. Now, Martin Harris has said of this story that it's about sexuality, sight, and cities. And as commentators have long been aware, the story is very odd from the start. It also obliges the spectator to think about mass death. So we have moments of looking, sexual transgressions, and the spectacle of a ruined city. And these three elements coalesce in the punishment of Lot's wife. Oddly, it forms part of a narrative that treats the possibility of bargaining with both God and with the angels. Of course, Lot's wife doesn't do this bargaining, and she is so terribly punished. David Jeffries has said that whether we regard the sin of Lot's wife as simple disobedience or a longing for fleshly pleasures, she's treated in the Bible as a type who turns away from salvation, as someone who refuses to abandon the world. St. Augustine expresses the idea wittily. Lot's wife, indeed, when she looked back, remained, and, being turned into salt, furnished to believing men a condiment by which to savor somewhat the warning to be drawn from that example. In 1936, this unnamed poem by A.E. Housman was published in his collection, More Poems. Halfway, for one commandment broken, the woman made her endless halt. And she today, a glittering token, stands in the wilderness of salt. Behind, the vats of judgment brewing thundered, and thick the brimstone snowed. He to the hill of his undoing pursued his road. Thank you.